Hi, I'm Cam,
And I'm Dev.
and you're listening to Criminalish, a true crime podcast where two best friends trade stories ranging from the wild and wacky to the downright messed up.
Do you love listening to the Criminalish podcast? Want to hear more from Cam and Dev? Then consider becoming a subscriber for $2.99 a month. Subscribers will have exclusive access to minisodes, Dev and Cam's live reactions to crime shows and documentaries, as well as early access to any multi-part episodes and so much more. Click the link in the description if you're interested in subscribing. See y'all in Cell Block C.
So, friend, before we get into the story today, what you drinking?
So I just got done with a workout not too long ago. So I have water, Fiji water to be specific. And then I also have a black cherry flavored sparkling ice water. Just, to feel a little fancy and so I can have bubbles in my system. What about you, Fran?
I'm enjoying a nice warm cup of tea by Puka. It is their chamomile, vanilla, and manuka honey flavor. And I honestly just needed something that was going to keep me calm and relaxed for our episode today. In recognition of Pride Month, I wanted to do a story that sheds light on some of the struggles that one of the most marginalized groups faces. And that group is Black trans women. So listeners, of course, want to extend some trigger warnings for today's episode. This is going to be a bit of a tougher episode, especially compared to our last two episodes. Specifically, just want to extend trigger warnings for violence against a trans woman, misgendering of a trans woman, and general transphobic statements and sentiment. With that being said, let's get into today's story, which is concerning the murder of Rita Hester. Have you heard of this before?
I don't believe so, just because the name isn't sticking out to me. So I'll let you enlighten me on this story.
So Rita Hester was born November 30th, 1963 in Hartford, Connecticut. She was one of 5 kids, and when you hear her family talk about her, you really just hear the love that they had for her. Specifically, when her sister Diana talks about her, she says that Rita never exactly came out, but her family always knew and accepted her for the most part. She said that she was just naturally accepted as a girl at an early age. And honestly, that makes me really happy to hear, because I know that for many trans people, they don't get that acceptance and acknowledgement from their family members from an early age.
Unfortunately, especially amongst Black family, queer children in Black families are typically treated so poorly, and it really upsets me. So I already know this case is gonna get me. It's gonna get me good.
This one, it might be a tearjerker. So if you are sensitive, like we are, have some tissues ready. So even though Rita's family was accepting, she didn't have the best time growing up in Hartford. Hartford in general wasn't very welcoming to trans people, and especially Black trans women. So Rita found herself often going to Boston, which was just a couple hours away from Hartford. And she really enjoyed it there because the nightlife scene was much more welcoming. So in the 90s, Rita decided to permanently move to Boston, and she moved to the Allston neighborhood, which, for our listeners who listened to the Gardner Museum heist episode a couple episodes ago, that actually is not too far from Fenway, where the heist occurred. And she wanted to move to Boston because she found that the nightlife scene was just much more welcoming to trans women. And shortly after moving, Rita was thriving. She was a fixture in the club scene, including both the straight and the queer clubs. And this actually was not that common. According to one of Rita's friends named Jessica Piper, she said, quote, "The other queens wouldn't go out to Alston from fear. And the straight Alston kids didn't want to go to the downtown queen bars." And Jessica wasn't the only person who was a bit wary of Rita frequenting straight bars so often. A lot of the elder Black trans people in the neighborhood actually warned her about getting involved with straight people from these bars because they knew how dangerous that could be. But Rita had this natural beauty, and because she was passing as a woman, she had privileges that many other trans people didn't have. But the trans people in her community knew that that didn't necessarily protect her from a lot of the dangers they still faced. But that being said, even despite these dangers, Rita was really in her element. Soon enough, she had gone from dancing at the clubs to performing at the clubs. And not just that, being paid to perform at the clubs.
Okay, Miss Ma'am.
And she was even being flown out to Greece and performing abroad in Greece.
Now she said I'm getting flued out. I love it. I love everything about that.
Getting flued out, right?
I love everything about that for her.
And if you know me, you know I love to dance. So this is a dream. Like, Miss Rita girl was really living her best life. Like, I can't imagine being paid to get flown out to Greece to dance and perform. Like, that's how you know she had it like that.
Especially if this is the 80s and 90s and she's doing all this as a queer woman, as a trans woman. She's that girl. She is that girl, and you need to get on her level.
A little bit more about Rita. Outside of dance, she loved to cook, and she would often spend time cooking and talking with her best friend, Brenda Wynn. She also had a pet cat and a pet boa constrictor, which I find very interesting. I don't know if I could have a pet snake.
You know what's funny? The idea of having a pet snake is not the confusing part for me. The part is that you have a cat and a snake and they haven't managed to kill each other. That's what I'm confused about. How did she keep them separated? How did she keep everybody in their own playpen?
I don't know. Maybe the cat had its own thing. The snake was covered and away. I'm not sure. That's a good point, though. That is a good point. Especially a boa constrictor.
About to say that cat was about to be snake food. You know, a little snacky snack.
Right. But in line with Rita just loving to cook and spend time with her best friend Brenda, they were actually so close that Rita spent Thanksgiving of 1998 with Brenda and her family. This was the first time Rita did not go home to Connecticut for the holiday. Shortly after Thanksgiving, on Saturday, November 28th, 1998, Rita and Brenda were playing racquetball early that morning, and Rita left Brenda's house around noon. And she told Brenda that she was going to be at the Silhouette nightclub later that night, which was a party spot that Rita visited frequently. But they had plans later that night to watch the figure skating competitions together. So Brenda was expecting her best friend back over. Around 4 p.m., Rita spoke with another friend and told that friend that she was going to be headed to the Silhouette Lounge. And that friend was planning on meeting her there. Her friend took a nap and went over to meet Rita just around 6 p.m., but sees that her street is blocked off with cops. And for our listeners, this is the part of the story where I'm going to describe the scene and what happened to Rita. So I recommend skipping ahead about a minute if you do not want to hear this part of the story. So here's what we know. Around 6 p.m., someone entered Rita's apartment and stabbed her in the chest more than 20 times. We know that at 6:12, officers responded to a call about a fight at Rita's address and were dispatched about 7 minutes later. When they found her, she was still alive on the floor and, of course, had multiple stab wounds. For some reason, more than an hour passed between when police were dispatched and when an ambulance actually took her to the hospital. And a neighbor also said that it took the police a long time to enter the apartment, even though the back door was open, which is just really frustrating to me. I don't see how that long can pass between a victim having just visible wounds, life-threatening wounds, and you getting them to the hospital.
Especially you prove that you could get there in 7 minutes.
Right.
There's literally no excuse. And especially, oh my God, she was alive.
I wasn't able to find anything stating that she said anything with her last breath, but by the time Rita arrived at the hospital, she'd already died of cardiac arrest from her wounds. And this was just 2 days before her 35th birthday.
If she died of cardiac arrest, that tells me that her wounds weren't initially fatal. She could have survived because it sounds like, and again, I'm not a medical expert. I just take in a lot of true crime and I watch a lot of doctors talk about autopsies. If she went into cardiac arrest and that is listed as her cause of death, that means she was just losing too much blood, that her heart stopped beating because there wasn't enough blood in her system to move it through her body, which also means that you left her lying on the floor of her apartment, alive and breathing and in pain for over an hour.
We won't ever know for sure if she would have survived had y'all gotten her to the hospital more quickly, but that does not negate the fact that there was so much time wasted. That does not negate the fact that she would have had a higher likelihood of surviving had y'all gotten her there faster. And it seems like at least part of the reason why they took so long and maybe didn't take this as seriously is because they saw a Black trans woman on the floor.
Absolutely. It's 100% giving transphobia. Like, and it pisses me off because it's not only transphobic, it's also racist as hell, because it's so clear that you already just don't care about trans people. So you don't care about trans people. And then on top of that, for them to be Black, you couldn't care less. There is no world where you can convince me that you care about people. We'll just stop it at people and allow her to die on her living room floor. That's ridiculous.
Yeah. And so back outside of Rita's apartment, her friend was outside the house and said that she just got a sinking feeling. She knew something wasn't right. And Brenda is back at her house waiting for Rita, but she actually didn't think much of Rita's absence. She had expected Rita to come over, but she just assumed that Rita had met someone at the club and forgotten to call, because this actually had happened before. And so Brenda is not expecting that anything has happened to her friend. And back in Connecticut, the local police called Rita's mother, Kathleen, late that evening, and over the phone let her know that her daughter had been murdered. They didn't even have the decency to come to her in person.
There is no excuse for that. So you're telling me you informed local police who had the ability to go to her home, and they also couldn't care enough to go tell a mother that she just lost her child? I don't care if the child is an adult. There are a few things in this world that will always hurt differently, and it is the hurt a mother feels when she loses a child. I don't care if that child is 50. I don't care if that child is 5. It hurts. And how dare you not have the decency to go say that to her face? How dare you?
And Rita's sister just remembers her mother calling her and just screaming over the phone. But now we're going to move on to the crime scene and investigation. So, police found that the locks on both the front and back doors were still intact, which made them believe that Rita had invited her killer in. They also found that the phone had been ripped from the wall. The only evidence that I could find in my research was that police found half a shoe print that was on the floor with blood on it. And this was something that I knew vaguely, but police don't actually clean the crime scenes after an attack or a crime like this. And it is often left to the families and friends of the victim to hire a specialized crime cleaner. But this can often run in the thousands, and Rita's family couldn't afford the cost. So Rita's sisters and her best friend, Brenda, cleaned the apartment by themselves in order to spare her mother from seeing the scene.
It's incredibly sad that is the reality of the situation, that not only do they not clean up these crimes, but to put the burden on the family to have to literally pick up the pieces of somebody's life is incredibly sad, especially if you're going to a crime scene of this magnitude. I'm gonna be honest, I don't think I would have the strength to do it. I would never have the strength to go and to go clean up after anybody that I knew and loved.
And I wish that there were resources out there for families that can't afford that cost, so that they're not having to do it by themselves and further amplify the trauma and grief that they're already feeling.
Especially if, this is happening days after she's gone. So you haven't even really had the time to fully process everything that's happened. And now I have to go to her apartment and clean her blood off the floor. That's a lot. And this is why I always say I obviously feel bad for victims. I obviously feel, anybody who was murdered, especially in a gruesome way, did not deserve the way that they were murdered. But I always talk about how bad I feel for families, how bad I feel for the people who are still living, because there is a burden that is carried with that. And things like that are what I mean by that burden of cleaning up after that loved one, of figuring out your life without that loved one, to, even her best friend possibly carrying on survivor's guilt. And I know somebody who personally takes responsibility for something bad that happened to a friend of theirs, because they were like, if I hadn't been late, if I had been on time to pick them up, would this have not happened? And that guilt that you don't deserve, it is not your fault, but it weighs heavily on you.
Oh, I agree. So, with the little evidence that was available, there were just a few leads for people to go on. And a lot of this information I found from Rita's family and friends, and not necessarily leads that the police had investigated. So, neighbors told Diana, Rita's sister, that they had seen two white men leaving Rita's apartment just after 6 o'clock on the day she was murdered. Remember that police were called around 6:12 p.m. So this would have been right around the time she was killed. However, we don't know how deeply that was investigated. And Rita also had a white boyfriend named Bobby, but no one could remember his last name. They just knew she had a boyfriend named Bobby. And it seemed like Bobby kind of disappeared after she was murdered. However, one of her friends did comment that he wasn't often seen out with her before her death. Rita also had relationships with other men, but no one really knew much about these because Rita was very private when it came to her dating life. So unfortunately, there was not much information on who these men were. Another lead was that Rita recently had an encounter outside of a bar where she punched someone in the face. And when her friend Brenda was asked about this a few years later, her recollection of it was hazy, but she said that this was most likely done to protect another one of Rita's friends, as Rita was that kind of person that was protective of her friends.
Girl, you know that's me.
Right. That's me too. I'll fight somebody.
Right. We can knuck and buck right now. I have no qualms with knucking and bucking and being ready to fight.
Yeah, especially if you threaten one of my friends. I'm not standing for it.
Oh, and what's so funny is if you threaten me, couldn't care less. I'll laugh it off and keep it moving. You threaten one of my friends? Oh, so your free trial for breathing has ended. Like it's over for you.
The last lead that I was able to find was that one of her friends mentioned that the night before Rita's murder, she'd met two men at a bar. The details are a little fuzzy here, with one friend saying that the men were Australian, and Brenda, who admittedly wasn't there, saying that she heard the men were Brazilian. But the friend who was there that night says that the men were Australian, one of them was young and one of them was old. And she said that she always got a bad feeling about those guys when she thought back on it. She got a feeling like they would carry knives with them or something. And those are all of the leads that we have. But in general, Rita's friends believe that her murder was the result of somebody or multiple people not being able to face the fact that they were attracted to a trans woman. And they believe that Rita was killed as a result of someone else's shame, which should never be the case. And having to pay with your life because somebody else, one, is not confident enough and self-aware enough to accept the fact that you can be attracted to women in all forms. And that does not mean that you were any less of a man or any less of who you identify yourself as. And also to realize that even if that were surprising to you, even if that was something you were not comfortable with, that is not worth another human's life. Because you took away a daughter, a friend, an aunt. You took away somebody that so many people loved. You took away somebody that brought so much light to the people around her. And unfortunately, Rita's murder is still unsolved to this day. In an interview that Rita's mother did in 2000, she said that it didn't seem like the police were doing anything. And they were basically already treating her daughter's case like a cold case. Not only was Rita's humanity as a Black trans woman ignored by her killer or killers, it was also ignored by the people who were supposed to be protecting her and protecting her community. And that is something that is an unfortunate truth for a lot of trans people, especially Black trans people. Now I'll move on to the community reaction and aftermath of Rita's murder. Rita's family and friends were, of course, distraught by this loss. And they held a vigil shortly after her death to bring attention to what had happened. And her mother was quoted saying, "I would have gladly died for you, Rita. I would have taken the stabs and told you to run. I loved you."
Bruh, that's what I mean. That quote encompasses everything I mean about you don't understand the hurt a mother feels when she loses her child. It does not matter how old the child is. A mother's love hits different, which is why I'm still incredibly pissed that you didn't even have the human decency to go tell her that she lost her child. Like, bump how you feel about how this person is living their life. That's irrelevant. This is a mother and her child. However she feels about her child is what the priority is. Your homophobia, your transphobia, your phobias are irrelevant.
Beyond the grief and sadness that came with losing a beloved member of their chosen family, the larger trans community was reminded of the dangers that came with being their free and authentic selves. And you can see this when you look at news coverage of Rita's murder. Although her death was still very present in the local news cycle at the time, many of the outlets that covered her story misgendered her. And this was not as surprising, I would say, for the mainstream newspapers like the Boston Globe and the Boston Herald. But it hurt a little more when a publication named Bay Windows, which was the largest gay and lesbian newspaper in Boston at the time, dead named Rita and referred to her as a, quote, cross-dressing man, unquote, and put her first name in quotes like it was a nickname. If our listeners don't know, dead naming is referring to calling a trans person by their birth name when they've changed their name as part of their transition.
You've got to be kidding me. How do you, as a publication, is it ran by queer people? Is that how it is?
I believe, yeah, it is gay and lesbian. The gay and lesbian newspaper. So at the very least, they should be well versed in covering queer topics.
Yeah. How are you as a queer media going to take the mainstream media approach and just completely disregard who this woman was? I'm sorry, and maybe this is problematic of me to say, but that honestly makes me more upset that you are part of this community and you still disrespect those members of your community.
I agree. And unfortunately, this was representative of the sentiment at the time where trans people were even further marginalized within the queer community, because there were many gay and lesbian women that did not think that a trans man was a man and a trans woman was a woman. They did not accept that fact. And not only did this add insult to injury for the grieving trans community, they also were looking at a case that had just recently happened and comparing the coverage of that case to the coverage of Rita's case. And the case that I'm talking about is the murder of Matthew Shepard, a gay man that had happened just a couple years before. His murder was covered extensively on national news and actually was part of the inspiration for a 2009 bill signed into law by President Obama, adding in protections against hate crimes based on sexuality.
So y'all really just don't care about women. Like, let's just go ahead and say it. Y'all really just don't care about women.
Right. And especially if that woman doesn't fit your definition of a woman.
Oh, and not only does she not fit your definition of a woman, don't let her be a woman of color. Like, I'm so sick of this. And quite frankly, like, I'm sorry. I'm trying to rein it in, but genuinely I'm so angry. Like, it's just so annoying that everybody does not get the same amount of respect, even in death, even in trauma, even in the telling of your story. Again, how dare you, queer publication, I am looking at you, how dare you not give her the respect of using her name, of not using her pronouns. And I'm not upset that mainstream media didn't do this, but to be honest, I expect mainstream media not to do this because they don't do it in 2023. But I expect more from your publication. I do.
So when speaking about this, trans activist Ricky Ann Wilson said, quote, "Which kinds of bodies count when they're bashed? The straight and queer media and the human rights campaign are all over that, unless it turns out that the man was wearing items of women's clothing. That story will not get reported." End quote. On top of the pain that came with seeing their friend disrespected in the media, they were also reminded that this could happen to them too. Because this was not a rare occurrence for Black trans women. In 1995, just 3 years before, a woman named Chanel Pickett, who lived in Watertown, Massachusetts, which is just 10 miles outside of Boston, was murdered. And her murderer, a man named Willie Palmer, was only charged with assault and battery and sentenced to 2.5 years because his lawyer used the trans panic defense, which essentially justifies the murder of a trans person because you did not know they were trans, and finding that out put you in such a state of shock that you did not have control over your actions.
So when a woman kills a man after he has been abusing her for years, she kills him, and we won't give her battered women syndrome. But a man kills a trans woman because he was so upset, and he gets 2.5 years. Meanwhile, the woman who defended herself gets life in prison. Got it. Again, y'all just don't care about women. You don't want to protect women. You don't want to protect people. How do you do that?
They only want to protect white cishet men.
Factual.
Preferably rich.
Preferably rich, because those are the only people that you protect. Those are the only people that you ensure know their rights. Those are the only people who get these expensive lawyers who get them 2.5 years in prison after they murder somebody.
So when investigating Rita's murder, a journalist found that she'd actually been interviewed about Chanel Pickett's death, and Rita was quoted saying, "I'm afraid of what will happen if he gets off lightly. It'll just give people a message that it's okay to do this. This is a message that we cannot afford to send." And it's so sad because she did not know how right she was.
That just sent a chill down my body. That's wow.
And in addition to the case of Chanel Pickett, later that year, in 1995, a Black trans woman named Deborah Forte was stabbed to death in the town of Haverhill, which is on the New Hampshire border, and New Hampshire is only about 45 minutes to an hour away from Boston. And in September 1998, just a couple of months before Rita's murder, another Black trans woman named Monique Thomas was killed in Dorchester. Both Deborah and Monique's killers were convicted of murder, which, compared to the outcome of many of these other cases, does bring a little bit of solace, but it doesn't bring them back. Rita's family and friends and the broader trans community did not want her death to be in vain. A woman named Gwendolyn Ann Smith, who was then the administrator of the AOL Transgender Community Forum, and another activist named Penny Ash Matz, organized the first Transgender Day of Remembrance. And along with this, Gwendolyn also compiled a list of all the Black trans women who'd been murdered since 1970 into a website project called Remembering Our Dead. And later on in 2014, she wrote about this. When the Transgender Day of Remembrance first began, trans people were nameless victims in many cases. Our killers would do their best to erase our existence from the world, and law enforcement, the media, and others would continue the job. And that's why it's so important to remember these names, even as it's been decades longer, and unfortunately, more trans people, specifically more Black trans people, have continued to face violence, oftentimes with no justice to accompany it. And unfortunately, along with this trend of marginalization, the Transgender Day of Remembrance originally fell on November 28th, the day that Rita was murdered. But this was changed to November 20th so as not to interfere with Thanksgiving, which is so ironic.
Oh, it's just another instance of, white people getting uncomfortable by history and the things that have happened and then wanting to move it and erase it for their own convenience. That's why in Florida right now they can't learn Black history. We can't talk about critical race theory and we can't talk about Black history in the education system in the state of Florida because it makes white people uncomfortable. That is literally why we can't do it. And the fact that y'all moved this day to make yourselves feel more comfortable so that you don't have to be faced with the reality of so many people, the reality that they have to look in the face every single morning because it makes you uncomfortable. We must move that and we must ignore their struggles so that you feel more comfortable.
And unfortunately, violence against trans people is now more prevalent than it was in 1998. One of my sources, when discussing some of the stats around the violence that trans people face, stated that at the time the article was written, which was March of 2022, there had already been 6 murders of Black trans women that year. According to the Human Rights Campaign, between January 2013 and July 2020, at least 231 trans and gender non-conforming people had been killed in the United States. 5/6 of these people were women, and 4/5 of these people were Black. So I would just like to take a moment of silence for us to remember our fallen trans siblings. If you would like to donate to some organizations focused on protecting and uplifting trans people and trans voices, we will be including a list of those organizations in our source notes. That's the end of our story today. Any other thoughts that you want to cover, friend?
I have so many thoughts and feelings about this case, and I will attempt to say most of them without anger. I will not promise that I will be successful. And it was the possibility that Rita may have been killed as a result of somebody else's shame. And I really just don't understand this shame as a person who is a cishet woman. I don't get this hatred of somebody because you found them attractive. Like, you can find somebody attractive. That doesn't mean that you want to be with them, that you want to sleep with them, or if you do, there's nothing wrong with that. Like, to me, it sounds so silly for me to find a trans man attractive and then hate myself for finding a fine man fine, you know?
Exactly.
Like, fine is fine. I'm that person. Fine is fine. But it's crazy to me that you sit here and think because you found that person attractive that you're no longer straight or that you have to change something about yourself or you have to change how you identify or how you think or anything like that. Because again, fine is fine and beautiful is beautiful. Like,
right. And I think too that's why Rita's friends were so wary of her going to those straight clubs, is because they knew that men specifically would get so angry once they realized they were attracted to a trans woman. And I think too, even when the men are aware that the woman is trans, that anger can still come out later on. There was a similar case covered by the podcast It's a Mystery for Me, where a trans woman was murdered by somebody, likely due to the fact that she was trans, even though her and her friend had always said that they would tell people up front to avoid situations like this. And like, men are so dangerous. It's always so funny to me when people say that women are emotional, because the fact is people are emotional, but oftentimes cis men's emotions are repressed, and because of that, they show up in such a violent manner.
Yeah, and not to mention the fact that depending on the household they grew up in, not only were those emotions repressed, but they also grew up in a household where violence was used as a viable option of handling issues. Maybe it wasn't even he ever saw his father hit his mother or anything like that, but it could be if he was beaten as a child, if he was allowed to get in fistfights with siblings. He was taught from an early age that violence is an acceptable response to solving your problems. This applies to all people, but specifically men, and specifically black men, are never allowed to feel their emotions and are never allowed to be vulnerable, which is why they are so pent up and angry all the time, because they're just never allowed to. Me and Cam talked on Saturday. I cried like a baby, and I felt so much better after the fact. Y'all need to sit around and cry. It is important for your emotional development
And the emotional health.
Yes, and I'm so sorry to you, but whoever told you you're not allowed to cry simply because you have male genitalia lied to you several times. Feel your emotions, feel them fully, and go to therapy, please. Like, it will do you wonders. Another point that I just kind of want to talk about too is the lack of investigation and the lack of human decency with this case. It is an unfortunate reality that not only is the person who lost their life disrespected and belittled in death, but then to not have any kind of respect or courtesy to those who are living and those who are attached to that person is an extra level that bugs me about this case. You all couldn't even pretend to care about this woman, in my opinion, from the moment you got there. To the way you allowed her to lay on her floor for an hour, to the way that you called her mother when you had the ability to go to her home. Clearly, you had her phone number. Clearly, you could have gotten an address. Because I'm sure if this is 1998, there is still a home phone on the wall. And that home phone is connected to an address. It sickens me. This whole scenario goes back to something that my mother taught me and taught all of my siblings when we were children, which is the golden rule is treat people the way that you would want to be treated. The platinum rule is to treat people how they want to be treated. And it is so clear that you didn't treat them the way that they wanted to be treated. You did not treat them like victims. You did not treat them like parents and family that had lost somebody. Because your chosen family cares about you just as much as your blood family does. Sometimes even more so. I want to finish this off saying I wish Rita's family the absolute best. I wish you all healing. I wish you all peace. I wish you nothing but good to come in your life and whatever that means for you. And I hope one day her case gets the respect and the resolution it deserves, as well as all the other trans people who have fallen victim to a society that doesn't care and appreciate and love you the way that you deserve to be loved and treated. And with that, I will descend from my soapbox. And that's all I have, friend.
So, thank you to our listeners for joining us on this episode. I would especially like to thank Kate Sosin from NBC and Them, which is an online queer magazine, for providing most of the material for this episode. If you'd like to check out photos related to this case, specifically if you want to see just how beautiful Rita was, please follow us at Criminalish Podcast on Instagram and TikTok.
Listeners, if you like what you hear, please be sure to leave us a 5-star review wherever you're listening to the Criminalish Podcast. And if you are listening on Spotify, please feel free to leave us any comments or questions. We would love to hear from you on this case. As always, stay nosy, my friends. Bye.
Bye.